This is American Education Chapter 8, Local Control, Choice, Charter School, and Homeschooling by Mary and Sarah.
Start by talking about the types of schools that we have. The first being public schools, which we should all be familiar with, and these are schools that have to accept everybody. In the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, it deemed that if a school was said to be unsafe or was failing, then parents of children in that school would have a say on which public school their child could go to. Next is charter schools. These are schools that can bypass the control that local school boards usually have on schools. It's a public school, so they don't charge tuition, but parents choose to send their child there, and students are admitted on the basis of a lottery. So it's similar to a public school, but the admission process is slightly different. There are also for-profit global education corporations, which aren't necessarily types of schools, but resources for schools, and these include online tutoring services, tests, management systems, etc. And usually it includes Common Core material and some examples of companies that you might have seen, like textbooks and such, are McGraw-Hill, Amplify, HarperCollins, K-12, Pearson, etc. And these corporations help to deliver individualized learning to students. And they've been really successful in providing these services and have earned a lot of money because of it. We also have homeschooling and online or distance learning. Homeschooling is really growing in popularity, actually, and it basically just avoids all federal and state control of education. So parents often use it as an opposition to Common Core, or they'll choose to homeschool their children for various reasons, such as religion or academics, specific needs of the child, the flexibility and choice of curriculum, as well as creating a positive social environment. And it's often the rejection of the traditional arguments for public schooling, so parents choose to go against that. And then for online schooling, the courses are just what deems it online school is just the courses are delivered through technology. We see increased online learning, especially in colleges. Obviously, we're seeing that right now with the e-learning that's going on in all schools. It can be a way to ease budget problems and also overcrowding in schools. But there's potential issues because at least in Florida, in the case of the Florida virtual schools, they had no limits on the amount of credits that a student was able to take, so that posed some issues. It also leads us to the idea of the school as a social center, which is basically online learning, but within the walls of a school and having all the services that a school typically provides. So this is an interesting concept that arises with online learning.
Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about private schools. So, private schools are independently run by an outside group rather than the school district of the area by the government. And state by state determines if private schools receive public funding and how much. And if schools do receive public funding, they're required to follow state education standards and testing. Typically, not every state is the same, but a lot of the times they are. And it's actually really interesting to see a lot of issues have come up recently in Indiana schools about private schools receiving public funding and what types of opinions these schools can have on certain debatable topics, especially ones that are religiously affiliated schools. And parents are, with the exception of vouchers, required to pay tuition at these schools, or if they get scholarships, stuff like that. And then there's also something a little further, which is an independent private school, which would be like Sycamore, is an independent private school, and they receive no state or federal funding, so that means that they are not mandated by law to comply with testing standards or curriculum standards, meaning they're creating their own independent curriculum, and parents are typically required to pay full tuition here, otherwise, unless their student is receiving scholarships. So now I'm going to give a brief overview of how school choice works. It's a super complicated process that's different from state to state and from country to country, so it's really hard to give a specific explanation of school choice as a whole. But on this slide you can see the definition of school choice, which is that school choice allows public education funds to follow students to the schools or services that best fit their needs, whether that's to a public school, private school, charter school, homeschool, or any other learning environment parents choose for their kids. And kind of a synopsis of that is that school choice provides parents and students with a portion of public education funding to allocate towards other options of schooling for children. And some of those options are scholarship tax credits, vouchers, charter schools, magnet schools, homeschooling, education savings accounts, tax credit or deduction for educational expenses, individual tax credit and deduction options, online learning, customized learning, and public schools.
For the discussion, we would like for everybody to pick two out of these three questions. So, either what type of school did you attend and how do you think it affected your education? What do you think about homeschooling or online schooling? Is it as effective as public or private? And then after experiencing online learning during this time, how has it changed your view of online versus in-person schooling? So pick two out of the three of these questions, and post a brief response to the discussion board. And potentially respond to other classmates and see what they have to say, so we can create some type of discussion about school choice.
Now I'm going to get into one of the most highly debated topics in education in America right now and worldwide, and that is the voucher system and how it relates to private school tuition. So not every state has voucher and school choice programming. So like when Sarah and I were talking about doing this chapter, she had no idea what vouchers were because they don't have them in Illinois where she's from, but in Indiana they do. And so here's some of the basics of voucher programming. Homes under certain income levels, which vary from area to area, what those levels are, receive a certain dollar amount that can be allocated towards private school tuition. So it's not like the government is paying full tuition for kids to go to private school instead of public school. That's not really what happens, and I think that can kind of be confusing sometimes. And families and students are required to take tests to ensure eligibility. So students have to be able to perform to a certain level that the school expects their students to perform at. Vouchers almost never cover the whole cost of tuition, which I have already said is a common misconception. And the money in vouchers does take away from funding that would have gone to public schools or the public school that that student would have attended, which is why it is a super highly debated topic, because a lot of times this money that is being used for private school tuition is taking away from things that students need in the public schools, and that's why it's such a big issue right now, is that students and families are wanting their children to leave school districts where they don't think that their kids are receiving adequate education, but then they're going to a private school and taking away funding from public schools that already aren't up to par because people are wanting to leave. So that's why it's kind of this endless cycle of not improving education systems, in my opinion. Now I'm going to discuss a little more about the voucher system specifically in Indiana. So there are more than 36,000 students enrolled in the system in Indiana, and 47% of families in Indiana are income eligible statewide. There are 329 participating schools. I know one that participates just off the top of my head is Brebeuf, which is a Catholic Jesuit school on the north side of Indianapolis. That's just one I can think of. I'm sure there's a lot more. And the average voucher value is about $4,500, and the value as a percentage of public per school per student funding is 44%, which is huge. And basically that means that every student that's leaving, half of the funding that would have been staying with them at the school is instead going to the private school. So that's a little bit just about the voucher system specifically in Indiana.